All right, we need to get started. Wow. All right. Announcements. February 23rd. That's January 23rd. Woo. Dalton, you want to mention that one?
Well, we're going to have a youth planning meeting to discuss the youth and what fundraisers we're going to be doing this year to try to raise money for camp and just plan some events.
All right, youth planning meeting, January the 23rd. That's 2 weeks from tonight at 5 o'clock. We need you here. The Holiness Summit is coming up in just a couple of weeks as well, the 20th to the 22nd. Brother Tom Lorimer will be our speaker. We'll have a service 7 o'clock on Thursday night, 10 o'clock on Friday morning, and then at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon will be a Q&A session where you'll be able to ask Tom your questions. And we may even have somebody up there with him. And then 7 o'clock Friday night, we'll have another service, and then 10 o'clock Saturday morning will be the concluding service. I'm really looking forward to this. If you've never heard Tom speak, he's really good. He and his wife Becky will be coming down. So if you can make it, even if you can't make it for all the services, come for what you can. But if you'll come Thursday night, I think you'll want to come back. There is an online registration for that. If you're going to be coming, please complete that registration so we'll know. As we will have, the ladies are preparing cakes and cookies. The Southwest Mississippi Zone is doing that for us so that we can have Afterglow. Y'all know what Afterglow is? After the service Thursday night, we'll have Afterglow, just a time we'll get together, visit, have a piece of cake or some cookies, some coffee, something to drink, and just a little time to fellowship. Not Thursday night, that's Friday night. Friday night will be our ice cream Afterglow, or ice cream social, whatever you want to call it. And we do that after the service Friday night. You know there's got to be ice cream. But, it is. I'll let him know after it's over. I'll tell him how good the ice cream was. That's it. All right. Any other announcements? Any prayer requests? All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer then. Keith, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Lord, we thank you for this day, Father. We thank you for the blessings you've given us, Father. Lord, we thank you for allowing us to be in your house, Father, today. Lord, just lead, guide, and direct our church, Father, where we can be the shining light that you would have us to be, Father. Lord, just bless the ones on our prayer list, Father, that's been mentioned, Father, this morning and also this evening, Father. Help them, Father, in a mighty way in whatever situations that they're in, Father. Lord, just lead, guide, and direct this service as we listen to Brother Bobby, Father. Give him the words that we can hear, Father, that we can go throughout the community, Father, and sow the seed of good news. Lord, just lead, guide, and direct us. And we ask all these things in your humble name.
Amen. All right, let's have a couple testimonies. Hadn't had those in a while.
I'm just so
Somehow.
thankful for the Lord giving us another year. I say that this is going to be a good year.
Amen.
It's always a blessing to come to church and actually, we have to serve the Lord. And I know when we're doing our work day and everything, and I remember the weeks before
When's the last time you read the Discipline? Bits and pieces, yeah. I remember about 10 years ago I opened it and looked at it for something. Yeah. There's a requirement in the Discipline that says that I, as your pastor, am supposed to go over at least one section of the Discipline every year. And I have neglected to do that the last year or two for different reasons. And I'm going to remedy that. So starting tonight, I'm going to look at the historical sketch tonight, and we're going to do a high-level look at the entire Discipline over the next probably 4 weeks or so, 4 or 5 weeks. And
You've got to make it interesting. Because it can be very dull.
how about if I give a test afterwards? Will that make it interesting? No? Give her a prize. Well, let's see. Huh? Do a pretest. Oh. Well, there's a thought.
Give a prize to the one that comes to every service.
So, with that thought in mind, then, a question. Who is the founder of Methodism? John Wesley. Actually, John and Charles. So, in 1729, two young men read the Bible. Let me read from this so I don't mess it up. And saw that they could not be saved without holiness, followed after it, and incited others to do so. So in 1737, they realized that holiness comes by faith. Now, there's some other things that kind of take place during this time frame. I'm not going to get into all the details, but they left England and went somewhere as a missionary. Does anybody know where they went as missionaries? They came to America, to Georgia. And Georgia was not a state at that time. It would have been the colony of, actually even, I'm not sure there was even a colony at that point, but they went to Georgia, and it was on their return trip to England that they were in the midst of a storm, and there were a group of people on the ship that helped John and Charles to see the need for holiness. Does anybody know what that group of people were? What they really would be a religious group. In fact, there's still some of them in the Carolinas and Georgia, I believe. They're similar to the Puritans, but it wasn't the Puritans. The Moravians. They were Moravians. And anyway, so on their trip back to England, during that storm, they saw the faith that the Moravians had, and they talked to them, and they developed some ideas from that, some things as they studied the scriptures. And in 1739, they began to meet together in London, and that's when they formed some of the first classes that would be. At first, they would call themselves United Society, and then eventually would become known as Methodists because of their methods. It's kind of some of the ideas that are some of the background for that. And the society that they had were looking at seeking the power of godliness, united in order to pray together, to receive the word of exhortation, to watch over one another in love, that they may help each other to work out their own salvation. So John and Charles then were kind of the impetus there in starting Methodism in England. Methodism first began in America with the coming of Robert Strawbridge and Philip Embry in 1766. I know some of this is kind of dry, but we'll get to the interesting stuff in just a few minutes. Actually, it's all interesting when you really think about it. Because, another quick question. What denomination were John and Charles Wesley? What church did they belong to? The Church of England, the Anglican Church. John and Charles both were ordained in the Anglican Church and never rescinded their credentials. In fact, well, I'll get to that in a moment. In 1771, Wesley sent Francis Asbury and Richard Wright to America. Have you ever heard of Francis Asbury? Have you ever heard of Asbury College, University now? Where's that at? Kentucky, just Wilmore, Kentucky, just south of Lexington. And it's named after Francis Asbury. In 1784, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury were named bishops of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, some of the history that kind of goes in with this, I'm obviously skipping over some of this, but have you ever heard of Coke, Thomas Coke? Does anybody know what the store for the Methodist Church is? Cokesbury. Cokesbury. Coke, Asbury, Cokesbury. Interesting, isn't it? See, when you learn history, we learn some of the background in some of these things. John Wesley never intended for there to be a new denomination in America. His intention was for it to continue as part of the Anglican Church. That was his intention all along. However, something happened a few years before this. This was in 1784 that Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke were named bishops of the Methodist Church. What happened before that changed some of the thinking? Let me give you a hint. July 4th. Revolution took place. July the 4th, 1776. These colonies became known as the United States and revolted against the King of England. There was a revolution that took place for the next several years, and 1784 is about that time frame when all of that came to an end, right? And we became the United States of America. Actually on July the 4th, but so petition was made to Wesley that that the church in the United States not be a part of the Church of England, because who is the head of the Church of England? Whomever is ruling in England, well, the king or queen. So today it would be Queen Elizabeth II would be the head of the Anglican Church. But then it was the king, and we just revolted against the king, right? So we had a problem with that. We turned away from him. And so they asked Wesley to allow the church in America to be independent of the Church of England. And Wesley grudgingly agreed to that, and that's when Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury were named bishops of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And that was the formation of the Methodist Church here in the United States. When they became bishops, now understand that this is perspective. Yeah, you know what perspective is? When you look at something, you look at it from a point of view. And so this perspective is from the early fathers of the Methodist Protestant Church. This is how they saw things, because they're the ones that wrote this. And well, I'll get to that in just a moment. But when the church was organized, there were several things that were a little peculiar, they said, and the most remarkable feature was the unlimited exercise of the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the church were vested by these traveling preachers in themselves and their successors to the entire exclusion of all the members of the church. No provision being made for any layman to vote as such and directly upon any question in any church meeting. So what that meant then is that you had no right to vote because you're the laity, right? You're laymen, lay people. And so your right to vote didn't exist. But it extended beyond that. Even I, as a minister, would not have had a right to vote. There were only certain ones that were given that right. And the way that it's worded in the historical sketch, excuse me, it says this fact explains the origin of the Methodist Protestant Church. The fact that that these early bishops, these early leaders, had such a and let me back up for just a moment. Where does that concept come from? Let me put it this way. One of the things that we're going to talk about briefly, I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but the Articles of Religion. Does anybody know where the Articles of Religion came from? Generally. Don't know? I'll give you a hint, because there will be a quiz then. Have you ever heard of the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church? Our Articles of Religion were drawn from the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church. Now, there are some differences and some changes that were made, obviously, that were necessary, but generally, that's what it's drawn from. Even the early Methodist Church, if you look at the early Methodist Church, in fact, the Articles of Religion in the Methodist Church and the Methodist Protestant Church in the early days were pretty much the same. There were some differences, but largely they were the same because they came from the same origin. The Anglican Church is ruled by bishops, and bishops have that final authority, and so the governmental structure was very much like that of the Anglican Church. And so even though the new church, the Methodist Church, was declared independent and declared a new church, it still was founded on those basic principles of the Episcopal form of government. Hence the name, the Methodist Episcopal Church, because that's what Episcopal means, by the way. It relates to a bishop being over the church. They were the ones that presided over everything. We still have bishops in various churches today, but it's not used necessarily the same way that it was then. So this legislation without representation then was the principle that really kind of guided everything. And the main protest that was finally brought was aimed at the feature of the government which was regarded as the real cause of all the dissatisfaction, and that is the exclusion of the laity from the councils of the church. One of the things that we're very careful to guard against in all of our meetings is to make sure that we follow the discipline. It's important to recognize why that's done. And when you look at the history of the church, we understand the reasoning for some of what we have in place in the discipline. And that's why it's so important that we know the discipline, that we know what's in there, that we know where we came from. Why does the Methodist Protestant Church exist? This is predominantly, this is the main reason why. Because in the early days, there in the early 1800s, the laity did not have a right to vote in the church. And so there were some disagreements over that. And there was a gentleman by the name of William Stockton who began publishing the Wesleyan Repository in May of 1821. And his intention was to really look a little bit more in more detail at the mutual rights of the ministry and laity, and rights that they felt, they being William Stockton and others that were in leadership, felt were being largely ignored. That periodical would become known as the Mutual Rights of Ministers and Members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. So petition was made. First of all, to the First General Conference in 1824, or first to the General Conference in 1824, and the petition was to allow this right to vote for the laity, to allow representation, that there be equal representation. And it was intended to draw them together so that everybody could come sit down at the table together and discuss this. The response was, if by the rights and privileges it is intended to signify something foreign from the institutions of the church, as we receive them from our fathers, pardon us if we know no such rights, if we do not comprehend such privileges. In other words, they totally ignored the petition, what was being asked, and what was, they would not even consider it. Things grew from there, and it got to the point to where members and ministers were brought on trial, were found guilty, and were evicted or excommunicated from the Methodist Episcopal Church. And the only reason why they could be identified was they disagreed with church leadership. Now, that's also important. One of the sections of our discipline is the judicial, and when we cover that on that high level, that's one of the things that will be brought out, is why that section is there. But men and women were kicked out of the church simply because they disagreed with what the bishops were doing and what they said. So in November of 1827, a general convention was held in Baltimore, Maryland. There were 100 delegates representing reformers in 7 states, and they put together a memorial to present to the next general conference, which would be in 1828. The general conference deliberated for 3 weeks on the memorial, and not only denied the necessity or justice of the of the change that was proposed, but even extended the claim for the exclusive right of ministers to legislate for the church beyond what had ever been attempted before. And that's when they then began to expel members of these societies. So members of the Union Societies, United Societies, were brought to trial and expelled from the church. They had no recourse. They had no church. The only church that they loved, the one that they believed in, as far as the doctrine was concerned, had said, you're not going to be a part of us anymore. And so in November of 1828, November the 12th, 1828, in Baltimore, Maryland, they met and formed the Associated Methodist Churches. Does anybody know where in Baltimore, Maryland they met? If you were to say St. John's Church, you would be correct. Isn't it? Did I? I believe that the church still exists, but I don't think it's a Methodist church anymore. Let's see about that. I don't know if we can get some information on that. So when they met in 1828, one of the things that they did was to put together a discipline committee, if you will. They put together a committee of men that would write the discipline. And in 1830, they came back and met again, and there were 14 annual conferences that met, approved the discipline largely as we have it today. There have been quite a few changes to it, but to a large extent, it was pretty much the way we have it today. And they formed the Methodist Protestant Church. That's when the name was adopted, the Methodist Protestant Church. So when did the Methodist Protestant Church start? What was the birthday for the Methodist Protestant Church? November 12th, 1828. That's the birthday for the Methodist Protestant Church, but we didn't get the name until 1830. But November the 12th, 1828 is the birthday of the Methodist Protestant Church. That's a good day to remember.
Why was Protestant?
Good question. Why do you think? Huh? Oh. Why is Protestant part of the name of the Methodist Protestant Church? Another way of putting it is Wesleyan Arminianism. That's a fancy term. We are part of the Protestant Reformation, is the right word here. The Methodist Protestant Church, Protestant is used pointing back to the Reformation, that we're part of the Protestant Reformation that started with Martin Luther. And we're Methodist because we follow the teachings of John Wesley. And Wesleyan Arminian, Arminius was a theologian that lived about the same time as John Calvin, and he's the one that really brought forth the concept of salvation by faith. That really, didn't bring it, but he codified it, I guess is a good way to put it. He's the one that really brought that together, that as far as doctrinally, that we're saved by faith, and brought that out, and some of the another thing that he was really instrumental in teaching was the free moral agency of man. And so when we bring all that together, then the Methodist Protestant Church, Methodist, we're Wesleyan Arminian, Protestant, we come through the Protestant Reformation. That's basically, that's the nutshell version of it. If you want a more detailed version of it, I'll get with you later. So when this group of, when this committee met over that 2-year period, they put together a constitution that recognized Christ as the only head of the church, and all elders of the church as equal, and secured to every adult layman the right to vote and to be represented in every church meeting, and to every itinerant the right of appeal from an oppressive appointment and a veto upon his removal from a charge, and et cetera, et cetera. It's all in there if you want to know all the details. It's in the discipline. Go read it. But the important thing is this. When they put the Constitution together, this concept of equal representation was extremely important to them because it's something that they did not have. Also, the right of appeal, and this is brought out more in the judicial section, but when we have our meetings, whether it's general conference or annual conference, and we have votes, have you ever been in a session where we did a vote and ministers were counted and laymen were counted? Have you ever been in a session like that? Do you know why that was done? Okay. Let's say that at the annual conference, we have 12 ministers present and 18 laymen present. Something is brought up that the laymen really like and want to pass that maybe would take away from the ministers. Well, all 18 laymen vote for it. All 12 ministers vote against it. What's going to happen? Huh? The layman would win. That's not equal representation, though, is it? So, what they said is, in order to have true equal representation, a split vote would be held then. The ministers would vote, and the laymen would vote. And both would have to approve the change for it to pass. Does this sound familiar? How well do we know our government? Not church government, but the government of the United States. You see, our forefathers, the ones who wrote the discipline, looked at the government that was formed for the United States and drew upon some of those principles in creating the church government that we have today. And so we have Congress, we have the legislature, and we have the Senate. Both have to approve any laws that are passed, and then it has to be signed by the president, right? And so there's that balance of power. Well, that's the concept that we have in the Constitution, that there's a balance of power between the laity and the ministers to prevent one side or the other from railroading their ideas and forcing their ideas upon the other group. And so that equal representation is there for that reason. And it's really an important aspect of who we as Methodist Protestants are. The right of appeal. What's the last committee that reports at annual conference? Does anybody know? If you were to say the appeals committee, you would be correct, because that's what it's there for. The plan of appointments is made. That's when pastors are assigned to their churches. And if a pastor objects to the assignment, or if the delegate objects to the assignment, then they can appeal that assignment. And that would go to the appeals committee, and they would have to meet to come to a compromise, come to an agreement. I think in all the times I've been at conference, I've seen that once, maybe twice, that's actually happened. But that's what it's there for, that right of appeal. And it's an important aspect of who we are. It's to make sure, again, that because when the bishop is in charge, the bishop says, Forest Grove, you're getting this preacher. You don't like it? Too bad. You're getting this preacher. He's coming, period. That's the way it would work under an episcopacy. But in our form of government, the way that it works is we have a stationing committee. The delegate meets with the stationing committee. The pastor meets with the stationing committee. We come to an agreement, and then that assignment is made. And if there's disagreement, then we appeal that. And that was all part of what was drawn up in the Constitution. There's a lot more that's in that, And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that point. But I think it's really important that we understand, again, not just who we are, but why we're here. What brought us to where we are today? Because it's important that we understand that to continue and to maintain who we are. The same thing with our government, with our United States government. If we ignore the Constitution, what's going to happen? That's possible. It'd be confusion. We'd lose our government. We would lose our freedoms, because that's exactly what would take place. And the same is true in the church government as well. In 1939, a majority of the Methodist Protestant churches joined the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South to form the Methodist Church. Does anybody know, before 1939, what was the second largest Methodist denomination in the United States? The Methodist Protestant Church was. The Methodist Protestant denomination was the second largest denomination, Methodist denomination in the United States prior to 1939. The basic differences that led to the establishment of the Methodist Protestant Church were not resolved, however. There was I think a lot of this was done in the background, and one of the delegates that was at this conference was Reverend F.L. Sharp. And Brother Sharp disagreed with what was being done, tried to object to it, saw that it wasn't going to work, and so he left the conference and came back to Mississippi to try to save as much of the Mississippi Conference as he could. And that explains why the Methodist Protestant Church is still in existence today, first of all. And secondly, it also helps to explain why we're so small now, because he wasn't able to save that much of it. In May 1944, the 29th Quadrennial Conference was held at Friendship Church in Jasper County. Anybody ever been to Friendship Church? You think so? It's a little church on Highway 18. And you go out from Bay Springs about 7 miles. It's on the right. And you got to be looking or you'll miss it. But that's where the conference was held. The first general conference was held afterwards. And Brother Sharp was elected president, a position that he held until 1960. A little bit more of the history. In 1948, at Mill Creek in Kosciuszko, the Alabama and Missouri conferences rejoined the church, the denomination. Anybody know where Mill Creek was? Have you ever been to Mill Creek Church? You have. What is it named now? I'm not sure what denomination has it, and it's been sold. The church itself has been sold. It was the Kosciuszko Church. Now it's what are they now? I can't think of the name of it now. But they withdrew from the Methodist Protestant Church and are now Congregational Methodist. But the Mill Creek Church was on Apponaug Road by Mill Creek, which is where it got the name. There used to be an old mill there, and that's why it was called Mill Creek. Anyway, the important thing is that that's when the Alabama and Missouri conferences rejoined. In 1952, at a conference held at Clear Creek in Brooklyn, we saw a mission opened in British Honduras. Anybody know where British Honduras is? Anybody know? What's it called today? It's called Belize.
Now, the first time I ever looked it up on a map, it was next to a long time.
Yeah, it's a little confusing. When I show my birth certificate, I was actually born in British Honduras. But anyway. And in 1961, Whitworth College was reopened. Where's Whitworth College? Brookhaven. It's now Mississippi School of the Arts. And it's on the,
Was those buildings already there when the Methodist Protestant took it over? Or did they have to build something?
no, the buildings were there.
And what was it before then?
I'm not sure what it was before that. I'm trying to remember the. I'll have to look that up. I've forgotten some of that history. It at one time it was a Presbyterian, I believe, school, and I don't remember if that was before or after. We had it. I'm thinking it was before, because the Presbyterian church is right across the road.
It sat empty for a while?
It sat empty for quite a while, yeah. In fact, one or two of the buildings had to be torn down. When it became, when Mississippi purchased it or acquired it, whatever, and it became MSA, before it became MSA, they revamped a couple of the old buildings, some of the old buildings, in order to maintain the historical value of the campus. But I know there was at least one building that had to be torn down because of it was just in such bad shape. There was no way to redeem it. It would cost way too much money to restore the building. So even the historical people lost out on that one. And it was the, I can't remember what it was called, but it was the building that had apartments and I think had some classrooms in it. What I remember the building is, I was probably younger than Alex, and we went up, LaDon, I think, was in school there at the time, and we went to visit Dr. Ivan Howard. And he was living in the apartment there at that time, or staying in the apartment there at that time. I think that was just before he built the house out on East Lincoln Road. Anybody know who Dr. Ivan Howard was? How many of you knew Helen Gerald? Dr. Ivan Howard was Helen's father. And he was also one of the founders of Wesley Biblical Seminary in Jackson. All right, now let's move to Forest Grove for just a minute. In the early 1900s, the need was seen for a church in this area. There were a lot of churches in this area already, were there not? I mean, we already had one down at Divide, and did we have one in Monticello yet? Anybody know? No is correct. That was started in 1951, early 50s anyway. I can't remember the exact year. Anyway, transportation was difficult at best at that time still. I mean, this is 1906, right? So transportation was difficult. And so there used to be an old school over on Renfro Road. And that's where the church was started. That's where There were a bunch of Lamberts and a bunch of, who else? There was 2 or 3 names. I think, were there some Ballards with it? No. It was Lamberts and, I don't remember. I'll have to go back and look at that. Anyway, they saw the need to start a church, and so the the Forest Grove Methodist Protestant Church was founded in 1906. Let's try that again. Let's go this way. The church was later moved to its current location, and this property was donated by your grandfather. And a wood frame building was built over here. If you look on this quilt that's in the hanging in the hallway, there's an artist's reconstruction of the original frame building that kind of shows the way that it looked to the best of her recollection. Anybody know who that artist was? Thanks, Miss Eleanor. Appreciate it.
I remember the old heater sitting in the middle.
The old heater sitting in the middle. It had the doors in the front, and there was one door on the side, and the windows. And
And when in the summer it was hot, all the windows was open. Back then, people went to each other's churches.
mm-hmm.
And I can remember the people sitting in the windows, standing outside, during the revival, from the other churches around where they come. And we went to there.
And there was a grove of oak trees out behind it, or kind of beside it, wasn't it? Which is where the dinner on the ground was held. Had the table out there. Mm-hmm. I don't remember this one, but there was one at Bear Creek in Utica that was the same way. And I can remember the tables out behind the church. And when we had a meal at the church afterwards, that's where the meal was held, outside, dinner on the ground.
Go out the back door and down the steps, which was a little bit taller than the front steps. And then go out in the woods there where was the relief station.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was for the ladies. But across the road, the men went over there, they didn't have a building.
Well, that wasn't fair.
Well, yes, boy, you got to stand up.
So the church has progressed from the early frame building to the property that we see today. We've actively served this community for over 100 years, and we have a very rich heritage. I think that it's really important that we understand what we have been given. And I'm afraid sometimes we take it too lightly. There was a lot of sweat and some blood that went into providing what we have today. And it's important that we remember that, because with that heritage comes great responsibility. And as in anything, whether it be the denomination, the conferences, or the local church, it's a heritage that has been passed down to us. And the mantle is now on our shoulders. And we have the responsibility of carrying that forward. And if we fail, what's going to happen? It'll be gone. The church will be closed. And I don't think anybody wants to see that happen. So we need to make sure that we take our responsibility seriously and that we do what we can to maintain and to grow the heritage that's been passed to us.
Let me ask you something. What is the general consensus of why the church broke apart into smaller groups, and we ended up with such a small group, whenever we would evidently be hit on the trough there for a long time?
Because so many had kind of bought into the idea that in my opinion, they forgot the history. And because of that, they were willing to reunite with the other Episcopal churches.
United still has the bishops and everything.
They do. The government of the Methodist Church today, of the United Methodist Church today, is somewhat different than it was in the early 1800s, but there's still the some of the main reasons were not resolved. One of them being equal representation, and one of the main drawbacks also from the 1939 conference was Article 10 in the Articles of Religion. Does anybody know what Article 10 is? It's Article on Sanctification. I have a copy of the Methodist Discipline following the 1939 merger. And in that discipline, it has Article 10, the Article on Sanctification. But there is a footnote at the end of the Articles of Religion that states this article was included as a compromise for the Methodist Protestant Church to join the merger of 1939. The article was included, the doctrine was not necessarily brought with it. So anyway, not all Methodists. Let me clarify something here. The Methodist Church taught sanctification. In fact, Asbury College, and for many years, was one of the most conservative colleges in the country, and taught holiness, taught sanctification. I'm not so sure about today how well it's done, but I know historically it was very much so. Kentucky Mountain Holiness Association, Mount Carmel, Kentucky Mountain Bible College. Leela G. McConnell was the founder of that work. Leela G. McConnell came from the Methodist Church, went to Asbury College, and in fact was a student at Asbury College when she began going to Breathitt County to preach, and eventually started the work there. And a lot of good preachers that have come out of Asbury College and Asbury Seminary. Brother Reggie Smith went to Asbury. But it's but that was one of the things. Some of the and it's in the historical sketch, but some of the social issues were there. Brother Sharp was not pleased with some of the things that were being presented, and which is why he objected to it. Any other questions?
Let me tell you guys a thing. In that old church, the pews in there were up just a little bit on the seat. Of course, the mat was just as straight as it could be, and there were spaces between the boards. It's like 1 by 4 or something supposed to that. Anyway, in the seat, they had cracks between it. And you know what the kids did. The one sitting behind you would get you in the middle of the service, and they put your foot up between that crack.
The pews in Belize were made with slats about that wide,
That's what it was.
and there was space in between. And so,
You guys did that too?
oh no, somebody on the other end would move just right, and it would pinch you.
Yeah.
Enjoy your padded pews.
Yes.
All right, if all hearts and minds are free, let's stand.